Hi, Captain Buzzkill here, ready to ruin another one of your favorite Bible verses. Just kidding, probably. This is a second in the series on reading the Bible in context and the importance of that. And the reason we want to do that is to obey 2 Timothy 2:15. We want to do our best to present ourselves to God as ones approved, workers who have no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. God put a lot of effort into getting his word to us just the way he wanted to, so we want to be careful on how we use that. And as we talked about in the first video, we believe that the original Bible text turned out exactly as God and the writers desired. He is the creator of all things, and if he put this universe together in its unbelievable complexity, he is quite capable of getting people to write the Bible the way he wanted them to. And we need to be careful about how we read it, and we should hold the same views about the Bible that he does. We talked about the key lesson that we can get from the Stand to Reason ministry, that is, never read a Bible verse or read just a Bible verse. We always want to read at least a paragraph or more to try to understand what's going on in the section, to make sure we don't misinterpret it, and to understand who it was written by and for, and the literary type and such. And my rule of thumb that if I don't know the context of a verse, I probably shouldn't be quoting it. And we do this because we want to overcome the barriers to reading in context. We know we don't like to admit we've made mistakes, but the solution is to get educated and get it right and read in context in the future. And we don't need to be afraid of getting it wrong, because there's plenty of tools to help us understand it properly. And as I'll show you, most of these you do not have to be a Greek or Hebrew scholar to understand. And sometimes we have a point we want to make with a verse, and that verse doesn't really apply. So we either need to find another verse, or we need to not make that point because it perhaps isn't valid. But the good news is that the real meaning of the passage is often better than what we wanted it to mean. So let's just trust that God will communicate what he wants to in his word, and that ultimately it will always be for our good. So let's look at a new passage. Are you familiar with Jeremiah 29:11? It's another one of those popular verses. It's one of the top, sometimes the top one, searched for on various Bible sites. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." So I like to ask people, when was the last time you read the book of Jeremiah? Crickets. Some people have never read it, other than hearing that verse. Others may have read it but have no idea what the context was. And also, what is the context of the book and of this passage? If you don't know that, then it's possible you're getting this verse wrong. Here's just a little bit more of chapter 29, which really tells you everything you need to know. There's more to it, but just going to verse 1 of Jeremiah 29 tells you a lot. It says, "These are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders of the exiles, and to the priests, prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." So we learn right away, this is a letter from someone to some people. It's from the prophet Jeremiah, and it's to people who were exiles from Israel. They had been taken away just as God promised, brutally so, because they had worshipped false gods over and over and over, and God had forgiven them many, many times, but finally gave them the consequence he had promised. So this is part of a letter to them. So if we're not them, then this isn't for us. There may be things we can learn from it, but whatever comes in this letter is not necessarily applying to us. Then, if you read on, he talks about how when 70 years are completed, I will visit you. I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. So there you can see it. If you just went back one verse, you would see that in verse 10, it says, he's talking about the 70 years that they were taken away to Babylon, as God had promised. And then God said, he will visit you and fulfill his promise and bring you back to Israel. So right there tells you what the context of verse 11 is. It's not a promise for all people at all times. for believers and non-believers, that God is going to prosper them and give them a future and a hope. Now, that doesn't mean some of that good news isn't somewhere else in the Bible, but it does mean that this particular verse is not some blanket promise to prosper you. So some questions. Again, what point do people typically try to make with this verse? I've usually seen it as kind of a one-size-fits-all feel-good that God is going to just you'll make your life better in worldly terms. He obviously makes it better if you trust in Jesus, but the way it's used is not like that. It's sort of a, if you're having a bad time, well, God's going to make it better. And that is not the case. Would we ever want to use that verse with non-believers? What is God's promise for people who die without trusting in Jesus? His promise is that they spend an eternity in hell. That's not good news. That is the last verse you would want to share with a non-believer. They would take it as a blanket promise that things are going to be fine for them, and that's the opposite of the truth. The promise of Jeremiah 29:11 was made to whom? It was made specifically to Israelites exiled to Babylon at a particular point in history, whom God was going to bring back after 70 years. Even if it applied to us today, what is the timing? Hint, 70 years. It was going to be far, far in the future. So if this is such a great verse to quote, and people let it just trip off their tongues, why don't they quote it the other chapters, or the other verses in this chapter and book? When's the last time you heard somebody quote Jeremiah 29:1 or 29:10? So obviously, I don't want to overkill this, but it's so misused by people, so reflexively used, that we really want to get out of the habit of doing that. And if we've got a point to make, and it's a valid point, then there are some better verses to use. For example, John 16:33. This actually goes against what people use Jeremiah 29:11 for, but there's still good news there. Jesus says, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So there's a couple great promises there. One, that we can have peace in him, and that he has overcome the world. But in the middle of that, the truth is, in this world we will have tribulation. That is not how people use Jeremiah 29:11. So this is a much more applicable verse. Or if somebody's really in tough times, use Matthew 11:28-30. This is a great, great verse, and it draws both believers and non-believers to Jesus. He says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's great news for people who desperately need Jesus, or for believers who are having tough times. It's the accurate verse to use. It's in context. And again, it points everybody back to Jesus, unlike the misuse of 29:11. Now, even though it's not a felony to misuse a verse, again, back to 2 Timothy 2:15, we want to be good followers of Christ and use the Word of God properly. But are there still some timeless and positive messages from Jeremiah 29:11? Yes, there are. You could do a whole sermon on this. Consider this. God makes fantastic promises, and he keeps them. We can't predict what's going to happen this afternoon, or especially not next week or next year, but God spoke into the future over 70 years and described exactly what was going to happen, and it happened. And it was unprecedented that a king would take people into exile and then send them all back because of a message from God. So this is a huge example of how God makes promises and keeps them. And it shows how he fulfills the prophecy that he'd given. And it's a great example of his grace and love. The Israelites did not deserve to come back. They deserved to be wiped out because they had broken the covenant they made with God again and again and again, just like we do. We rebel, even though we know better. So there's some really, really positive messages there. So to summarize the stand to reason philosophy of never reading just a Bible verse, I encourage you to read the Bible in context. Do those two things. Read it every single day. It is the Word of God. It'll accomplish what he set out to do with it. It will transform your heart and your mind if you don't get in the way. But always read it carefully and read it in context. It's easier to do than you think. Blessings to all of you.